I'd like to welcome all of you guys to lunch today. I'm Christian Hahn, president of the UNH Federalist Society student chapter. This is our inaugural event for the year. We have a couple more in the works of getting planned for this semester as well as in the spring. So we look forward to having a good attendance at all of those. Also, our general interest meeting will be tomorrow in room 200 at noon. Also, more food. Sorry we ran out of burritos a little bit ago, but I promise we'll have plenty of food tomorrow. I'm about to go up that order. Anywho, so if anyone wants to join us for lunch tomorrow, like I said, room 200 at 12. And beyond that, I'm going to turn this over to my Vice President, Samuel Chance, to introduce the speaker.
All right, welcome everybody. Just some boilerplate before we get started. This is being live streamed and video and audio recorded, so if your grandma's on the YouTubes, don't say anything you don't want her to hear. Also, just be advised that there is a no weapons policy on campus. Guns are not allowed on campus, so if you have anything of that sort, please remove yourself. Today we're going to have a great discussion on gun-free zones and college campuses. Our speaker today is Dr. John Lott. He's an economist and world-recognized expert on guns and crime. He has held teaching positions at various institutions across the country, including University of Chicago, Yale, Wharton, Stanford, and Rice. And he was also the chief economist of the United States Sentencing Commission from 1988 to 1988 till 1989. He is currently the president and founder of the Crime Prevention Research Center, and noted Nobel laureate Milton Friedman once said of him, "John Lott has few equals as a perceptive analyst of controversial public policy issues." He's probably most known for his book, More Guns, Less Crime, and his most recent book is The War on Guns. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Lott.
Hey, thanks very much for having me here. I greatly appreciate it. I guess this type of thing, usually a debate may work a little bit better, but we'll give it a shot. So there's three general points that I want to try to make with regard to concealed carry on campus. One is, what's the behavior of permit holders? And then try to go through some of the specific concerns that people have about concealed carry permit holders and the problems that might occur on campus. And then talk about the possible benefits that might arise from people being able to carry. You know, when you look at the behavior of permit holders, I think the data indicates that they're extremely law-abiding. I would argue it's hard to think of almost any other group in the population that's as law-abiding as they are. We have over 14.5 million concealed carry permit holders as the beginning of this year, and revocation rates for any reason are like tenths or hundreds of 1%, and revocations for firearms-related violations are usually thousands or tens of thousands of 1% when you look across states. Give you some data for a couple states here. New Hampshire, it's a little harder to get kind of detailed data because it's harder to know the total number of permits that are issued here. But in Texas, Texas had 1 million permit holders this last year, and there were 108 permit holders who were convicted of either a misdemeanor or a felony. That's a revocation rate of about 1/100th of 1%. For Florida, between the period of 1987 and May 2012, they had 2.1 million people had permits. 168 were revoked for any type of firearms-related violation. That's 8 thousandths of 1 percentage point. And most of those are fairly trivial. The most common two types of violations are people either not having their permit with them when they're carrying, or accidentally going into a gun-free zone. In Texas, probably the most famous example of something like that is Barry Switzer, the former coach of the Dallas Cowboys. Any football fans may remember him running into the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, forgetting that he had his concealed handgun on him. Alarms went off. You know, it's true the Cowboys were having a pretty bad year that year, but I don't think most people viewed him as a real danger. One thing you can do is compare the behavior of permit holders to police officers. And there's a study published in Police Quarterly that looked at data for police officers from January 2005 to December 1st, 2007. Now, the way they collected these data was from newspaper reports around the country. And so there are a couple reasons to believe that they actually underestimate the crime rates committed by police, because not all the cases may get newspaper coverage, and they may not have found all the newspaper stories about these incidents around the country. But even so, police officers are rarely convicted, about 1/30th the rate of the general population. You can see for misdemeanors and felonies, it's about 1/10 of 1%. For firearms-related violations, it's about 2/100ths of 1 percentage point. But if you compare it for Texas, for example, Texas permit holders for any type of firearms or any type of misdemeanor or felony, it's 1/100th of 1%. So that's 1/10 the rate for police officers. And for firearms violations, it's 2/1000ths of 1%. So that's about 1/7 the rate that police officers are. Now, so what's the experience that we have around the country? We have 11 states now that essentially mandate that public universities have to let people with concealed carry permits carry on campus. Kansas's law hasn't gone into effect yet, but it has in the other 11 states. And there's 21 additional states that leave it up to the individual school to decide, though in most places, the vast majority of them, they don't allow people to carry even when they have the discretion. You have some big schools like Michigan State, for example, that allows people to carry on campus. Just so you know, it's not just now. If you go prior to the early 1990s, the states that had concealed carry at that time generally allowed people to carry on school property, whether it's K through 12 or university. It's only when the Federal Safe School Zone Act was starting to be debated and discussed in the early 90s that you started seeing individual schools put it into their faculty or student handbooks, banning people be able to go and carry on campuses. But despite that huge amount of experience that we have on this, there are a couple of things that are pretty easy to point out. We have all these concerns about drinking, irresponsible behavior by young college-age permit holders. But it's one thing to go and say, okay, well, students as a whole might be irresponsible. It's another thing to go and say the people who are willing to go through the process to go and get a concealed carry permit represent some type of risk. And I'll show you some data on that in a minute. There are a couple things that we can point out pretty clearly. One is, with all this experience, there's not a single example that you can point to where a permit holder who's allowed on one of these campuses has committed any type of crime. There's 5 incidents, I need to update this, where you've had accidental discharges occurring on campuses, but none of those have been life-threatening. For 3 states, I've been able to go and obtain data by year of age for revocation rates for permit holders, for Michigan, Nevada, and Texas. So you can look at 22 and under and 23 and above, and what you find is, as I mentioned, the revocation rate for everybody who's a concealed carry permit holder is incredibly low. But actually in 2 of these states, college-age permit holders have a lower revocation rate than it is for the rest of the population. The one exception is Nevada, where it is slightly higher, but it's not statistically significantly different. Now, when you listen to legislative debates around the country about concealed carry on campus, there are 2 issues that come up time after time. And one is, if you have a mass public shooting on campus and you have some concealed carry permit holder, the concern is that the permit holder will accidentally shoot a bystander. Or the other concern is that when the police arrive, they'll get confused and accidentally shoot the permit holder rather than the bad person that's there. The thing is, often you find in debates on gun control, possibility things that might go wrong. But we can look at data. We don't have to guess at these things. I have on our website at crimeresearch.org literally dozens of cases over just recent years where mass public shootings, according to either police or sheriffs or prosecutors, have been stopped. And in that one case has a permit holder who stopped one of these mass public shootings accidentally shot a bystander. In that one case has a permit holder been shot by the police. Just as an aside, it's interesting when you look at these cases, the whole list of cases we have, none of them got national news attention. But you'll have cases like last year, there was a volunteer fire department in South Carolina where they were having a kids' day and giving kids rides on the fire trucks, giving them ice cream, having games. And a man came up, started firing his gun. Fortunately, there were two volunteer firemen there who had concealed carry permits, and they were able to stop him. I mean, we can only imagine if they weren't there, what type of news coverage it would have gotten. Last year, there was a case in Chicago where a gang member went out to a busy city sidewalk in Chicago, started firing his gun. There was an Uber driver who had just dropped off a fare, got out of his car and wounded the shooter there. You know, the state's attorney said that he had clearly come to the aid of many people who would have been harmed otherwise. You have a case in Conway, Georgia, for example, where a man went to the liquor store, started firing his gun, killed two people. Fortunately, there was a permit holder who was walking by outside, heard the shots, came in. This is actually caught on tape, and exchanged fire with the gunman. The gunman ran out of the store at that point. The sheriff for the county said that there's no doubt in his mind that if the permit holder wasn't there, many other people would have been killed inside that liquor store. And I can go on. I mean, there's cases in Philadelphia last year, there's cases this year. But as I say, one of the amazing things is how little news attention these get. You'll find them getting some local news attention, but even something where you know if the people weren't there would have gotten massive national news attention, doesn't get anything locally. I'll just give you one example from this year. You know, just 10 days after the Orlando shooting, most states, 40 states, allow people to carry permanently concealed handguns in establishments that get more than 50% of their revenue from alcohol. Florida was one of the 10 states that didn't allow that. But just 10 days after that attack, there was an attack in a nightclub in South Carolina where a permit holder there, 3 people were shot. And at that point, a permit holder pulled out his gun and wounded the attacker that was there and stopped the attack. But you didn't hear about that, you know. But my guess is if he hadn't been there and multiple people had been killed, then it would have gotten probably even more massive news attention than otherwise, simply following on the heels of the Orlando shooting. Anyway. So as I said, we don't need to guess on these things, and in none of those cases did bad things happen in either of those two varieties. You know, there's, I guess few people realize how pro-private gun ownership police are. If you doubt, you should read the questionnaire that the Fraternal Order of Police gave out to the presidential candidates this last year, right now, and you may have a guess one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton didn't even ask for the Fraternal Order of Police endorsement. But Police One is the largest private organization of police in the country. They have about 450,000 members. 380,000 of them are active full-time law enforcement. The other 70,000 are retired law enforcement. And in March 2013, after the Newtown attack, one of the questions that they asked is, considering particulars of recent tragedies like Newtown and Aurora, what level of impact do you think a legally armed citizen could have made? So it's essentially dealing with this issue of gun-free zones. 80% of the police said that casualties likely would have been reduced. Another 6% said innocent casualties would likely have been avoided altogether. So you have 86% of the officers that were surveyed indicated that it would either reduce or even possibly eliminate the types of attacks that occur. And here's just another example. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high, how important do you think legally armed citizens are to reducing crime rates overall? So you essentially have about 76% or so saying that private gun ownership is either extremely or very important in terms of reducing crime rates. I did some work with Bill Landis at the University of Chicago when I was there. And Bill and I looked at all the mass public shootings around the United States from 1977 through 1999. And we looked at 13 different types of gun control laws. And the only one that we found that made any difference in terms of mass public shootings was the passage of right to carry laws. When states passed these laws, there was about a 60% drop in the rate of these mass public shootings. And to the extent to which these attacks occurred, they virtually all occurred in those few areas where permitted concealed handguns weren't allowed. There are a couple of interesting results that we had here, and that is, when states pass right to carry laws, as the percentage of the adult population with permits goes up, you see drops in violent crime rates across the board, but you particularly saw these big drops in mass public shootings. And so the question is, why would you have such a much bigger drop in mass public shootings than you're going to see for murders generally? I think there's a simple explanation for that, and that is one thing you kind of learn when you're going through this type of kind of economics of crime is that if you make something more costly, make something more riskier, criminals are less likely to go and engage in that type of crime. And so, just imagine, let's say you have 5% of the adult population in the state with concealed carry permits. Criminals thinking about attacking somebody late at night in a parking lot or an alley. That's some risk to the criminal, and you see some deterrence. But let's say you have a room like this where we have maybe 60 people here in the room. Even if the probability of any one individual having a concealed handgun permit is 5%, what's the probability that at least someone who's unknown to the attacker is going to have a concealed handgun permit? Ignoring the fact that this is the Federalist Society and that, so the probabilities are probably not independent of each other. But just assuming that they were, you'd still be dealing with the fact that essentially, 100% probability, and so the risk is much higher, and you see greater deterrence that's there. The other thing that you realize when you're going through this is the huge strategic advantages that terrorists or these mass public shooters have. Police, anybody who's read my research knows that I think police are extremely important, probably the single most important factor for reducing crime. But the thing is, police have a virtually impossible job when it comes to stopping these types of terrorist attacks or mass public shootings. And that is, you have somebody in a uniform going and guarding a place. It's like a neon sign making them a target for these attacks. And so, whether it be something like the Charlie Hebdo attack in France last year in January, where the first person killed was a police officer assigned to guard the magazine, or the Orlando attack, where you had a guard there and he's the first person that the shooter shot at there. Those are the first people whose lives are going to be at risk. If a terrorist or somebody else is thinking about attacking a place, they have certain options. If they're going to attack, they'll kill that person who's guarding first. Or they can wait for them to leave. Or they can go and pick some other target. After the Charlie Hebdo attack, the president of France, his response was to go and put 10,000 military troops on the street of Paris to try to protect things. Well, there were 3 other mass public shootings last year that had occurred. And I think, if anything, it illustrated the fact that whether you had 10,000 troops or even 100,000 troops, I would argue it would be pretty much impossible for them to go and guard all the possible targets that are there. I'll give you one interesting fact you may not know, but the concert attack that occurred in November last year, there were 8 off-duty police officers who were attending the concert. But because of the fact that France banned off-duty police from being able to go and carry guns, none of those off-duty officers were able to do anything to go and stop the attack when it occurred. Israel, for example, has had to deal with mass public shootings, mass killings since the time it became a country. Well, one interesting thing happened. If you look at 1972, so they've been having terrorist attacks from the 40s on. Prior to 1972, virtually all the terrorist attacks in Israel involved machine guns. After that point in time, the vast majority of terrorist attacks involved bombs. Does anybody know what changed? There's no I'll tell you right now, there's no technological change that occurred in people making bombs at that time. There may have been some changes in the 80s. But you see a very distinct change occur right at that point in terms of how terrorist attacks occurred. Do I have an idea what changed at that time? Well, they started allowing civilians to carry guns. Now, why would that change how terrorists would go and engage in their attacks? Well, if you have a terrorist pull out his gun, you give people a chance to go and respond. There's one, in my earlier book, More Guns, Less Crime, I have one quote early on in the book from a newspaper in Israel about a terrorist attack that occurred shortly after this change in Tel Aviv, where 4 terrorists on kind of a school day, early afternoon, had gone and attacked the mall outside of Tel Aviv. They pulled out the machine guns, started firing. People in the mall started firing back, killed 3 of the terrorists, and 1 was severely wounded. The reason why I included it is because when the terrorist who was wounded was being taken to a hospital in an ambulance, the attendants in the ambulance reported to the newspaper that he was really upset, uncontrollably angry, that no one had told him that the middle-aged ladies in the mall there, kind of on a school day afternoon, would have handguns with them and were able to go and kill his fellow terrorists. I guess he thought it as kind of an affront to his manhood that these middle-aged ladies had taken out their crack terrorist attack team. Okay. But what Israel learned is that over those decades, they had spent more money on, when they had terrorist attacks, hiring more police, putting more military on the streets. But at some point they realized that no matter how much money they spent, if the terrorists were simply willing to be patient long enough, there'd be some opening that they could go and attack. And what they learned was that, so I have a couple police on a bus and there's a terrorist there. The terrorist can kill them first or wait for them to leave. But when you started allowing civilians to be able to carry, that took away the strategic advantage that the terrorists had, because they didn't know that even when the police left the bus, whether there was somebody behind them or to the side or in front of them, that they still had to go and worry about it at that point. Since 1950 in the United States, over 98% of the mass public shootings have taken place where general citizens aren't allowed to go and have guns. And one of the things that you learn when you go through these cases over time is how frequently these killers explicitly, in diaries that they leave or other things, explain why they picked the particular target that they did. There's just a case from the spring where a father in Detroit was concerned about his son's involvement with ISIS, had contacted the FBI. The FBI put a tap on the son's phone, and they have an amazingly chilling recording where the son is explaining to the Patriot why he was targeting one of the largest churches in the Detroit area. He had cased the church, gone to services a couple times, seen that they had very large turnout at the services, and when he was explaining why he picked that, the first reason that he gave was that the church had banned anybody from having permanent concealed handguns on church property. And he explained how that would make it easier for him to go and kill other people before someone with a gun was able to run. Just to give you an idea of the type of planning that often goes into these types of attacks. He had actually looked to see where the nearest police stations were and driven the route to get an idea how long it would take possibly for police to go and arrive on the scene if he was going to do the attack. Unfortunately, the police arrested him and stopped it before any attack could occur. But, you know, you have other cases. You have the Charleston church shooting. His original target was going to be Charleston College. But when he looked into the security that was there, he decided not to go and attack that. You have cases like the Lafayette movie theater shooting that year, or the diary that came out from the Batman movie theater shooter last year, where James Holmes, his original target was going to be the Denver International Airport. But he looked around there, realized the amount of security, and he was concerned that he wasn't going to be able to kill people before he himself was killed. If you read from the previous year, you can go and read the manifesto for the Santa Barbara killing. He goes through excruciating detail talking about, you know, once you get by all the dozens of pages about him complaining that women don't realize what a wonderful guy he is. He explains his original target was going to be spring break in Santa Barbara. Apparently, kids from all around the western United States go to Santa Barbara to celebrate spring break. But he decided against doing that because he went to the local library, pulled out old news footage, and checked to see the security arrangements that were there. And he just saw so many police officers there that he wrote in his diary that he was concerned that he would be killed before he was going to be able to kill his targets that he wanted to go after. You know, it's just, the James Holmes case, I'll just mention this. You know, here you have a guy who cased movie theaters before he chose one. Now, I don't have it written down why in his diary he picked the particular one that he did. But it is interesting that of the 7 movie theaters that were within a 20-minute drive of his apartment, only one of those movie theaters posted a sign banning permitted concealed handguns. And it was the one he went to. He didn't go to the movie theaters that were closest to his home. He didn't go to another movie theater that was the exact same distance as the one he picked, that had the largest auditoriums in the state of Colorado. You would think that might be an attractive target to someone on the premiere of a Batman movie theater movie night to go and have as many victims as possible. Instead, he picked the only movie theater that posted signs banning permitted concealed handguns. And while we don't have statements for many other killers, we see a similar type of pattern. You look at the Omaha, Nebraska mall shooting in 2007. There are 8 enclosed malls there in the city. Only one of them posted signs. Again, that's the one the killer went to. It just happened to be the farthest from his home. Kansas City, Salt Lake City, Portland, Oregon. Again, in all those cases, you'd have either 1 or 2 malls. In Salt Lake City, you had 2 malls that posted signs. And yet, they could just be random. But at some point, you have to begin to ask yourself, how is it possible that these guys, time after time, seem to pick the venue where people aren't able to go and protect themselves? I'll end with referencing Ron Noble, who was Secretary General for Interpol for 15 years, from 2000 to 2015. Ron, when he first of all became Secretary General, he was strongly in favor of gun control. This is kind of Europe's version of the FBI, though. They obviously cover the world. And but he changed his views over time. And after the mall shooting in Kenya, he made some statements that he's been making since then that, look, he's become convinced that there are 2 ways of stopping these types of attacks. You can go and create a gun-free zone, or you can let people defend themselves. But he says he's become convinced that no matter how hard you try, it's essentially impossible to stop these people from being able to get guns and weapons into these gun-free zones. I mean, you can put up, the movie theater shooting for James Holmes. They had guards at the front checking people. He went to the movie early showing, propped open a door from the back of the movie theater, was able to come in the back that was there. You know, there's so many possible ways for people to get in, and if you give people enough time, I mean, often, as Ron Noble was pointing out, these people are planning these attacks 6 months at least, 2 years often in an attack in advance. The Newtown killer was planning for well over 2 years in advance. And if somebody's going to be planning it that long, it's simply impossible to try to actually create really gun-free zones. And so he said the only thing you end up doing in these cases is making sure that the victims there are the ones who are going to obey the law and are going to be disarmed. Anyway, I'm happy to go and take any questions that people have about this issue. But, yeah, I just would say this is a general problem that you have with gun control, and that is, we all want to try to make people safer. And I understand the desire if you simply say guns aren't allowed in a particular area. You think, well, they'll make people safer. But the problem is, I would argue, you actually create a magnet for people who want to go and kill other people to go there. And I suppose the simplest way to think about this is just, let's say, God forbid, you were being stalked or threatened, or somebody in your family was. Would you feel safer putting a sign in front of your home that said this home is a gun-free zone? Would that make it so that the killer there would say, well, I can't bring a gun into the place there, so I won't attack? My guess is nobody would do that. I've debated lots of people over the years. I've never run into anybody who would say that they put a sign like that in front of their home. The question is why? Because they know that rather than repelling the person, it would actually make it more likely for them to go and do the attack there, because they would think it would be a relatively easier target than it would have been otherwise. And so my only question to you is that if that's the way you think about that, why do we put those types of signs in front of other places that we think are particularly vulnerable to an attack? Why do we think that somehow these attackers are going to somehow operate differently in other venues than they would in a place like our home that they might want to attack? Well, I appreciate your time, but I'm happy to take any questions that you guys have. Yeah.
Do you endorse Israel's approach to gun control?
Well, I mean, Israel has a lot of people that have guns. They have about 15% of the adult Jewish population carries concealed carry. That compares to about 6% in the United States. And the other thing you have to realize is that a lot of what they have on paper isn't actually how they go and operationalize it. Israel probably has a larger percentage of the adult population owning guns or possessing guns than we have in the United States. There's there's something called the Small Arms Survey, which is basically gets a lot of publicity. If you read the New York Times or something like that, you probably see it mentioned about 40 times in the last 3 years or so. And that will claim that only about 7% of the adult Jewish population owns a gun. The problem is you have to realize, technically in Israel, the government owns the guns. You may have possession of it for 50 years. You go and apply for it and they give it to you. It seems to me what we should care about is whether people have possession of guns as opposed to who technically owns the gun in that situation. But if you look at who possesses a gun, then Israel has a gun ownership rate that's probably about, maybe 20 percentage points or so higher than what we have here in the United States.
But there are a lot of regulations in place as to who can get the guns, correct? Including you have to work as security law enforcement, you have to be over 21, a resident of Israel for 3 years, pass a mental exam, a physical exam, a shooting test, and background checks by the public safety ministry.
And as I just said, and for carry, technically you're supposed to live in certain areas of the country.
Like the West Bank.
Right. But the point I was just making is that you look at the rate that people carry, you look at the gun ownership rate that's there, and you talk to people, that in terms of how they actually operate, the rules are much more liberal than you would think by just looking at the actual rules that are there. Those are technically the rules that they have, but in practice, they end up letting a lot more people actually go and have the guns that are there. So you have, in the United States, you look at surveys, of course, there are problems with surveys in terms of whether people are going to admit to having guns or not. We're talking about someplace around, let's say, the mid 40% range for most of the surveys. You have a couple surveys that may show low 30% range. But in Israel, it appears that you're talking about almost 2/3 of the adult population having guns. And so I would just say you have to differentiate between the way the rules are actually operated in Israel versus how they're technically written down. Yeah.
Do you see I mean, we have a trend growing now with constitutional carry being passed in Maine and Missouri in the last couple of years. Do you see a trend with the no carry on campus laws being written off the books, or is that something that still hasn't developed?
Sure. Well, I mean, you've had a number of states recently. Just this year, you had Texas and Tennessee with those laws. Kansas, this law is going to go into effect next year. So, I mean, there's been a pretty big change that's been happening there. You know, it's basically the same type of arguments that you saw when concealed carry were brought up. People bring up fears about things that might possibly happen. If you go back and read the legislative debates, read the newspapers at the time in different states when they're passing concealed carry, you're going to find the exact same concerns about permit holders just in general. And now it's transferred to what might happen on school property. And what you had happen was that people would raise those types of concerns. The laws would get passed. You'd have a newspaper article 6 months or a year after the law changed, and they'd say, you know, none of the fears that people had have occurred. And that would impact other states. I testified over several times in Ohio, for example, and on concealed carry. And each time I was brought in, there'd be more states that adopted the law. Last time I was there, every state that surrounded Ohio had adopted concealed carry. And at that point, you know, you just go and say, okay, every state that surrounds Ohio has this law. Can you point to any of the problems that you claim would occur for Ohio that's occurred in any of these other states? And at that point, usually the debate would be something, well, I just don't think that there are going to be any benefits. And if the worst people can go and say at that point is that they don't think that there's any benefits, then the debate is pretty much over in terms of being able to stop these things. And my guess is you're going to see a similar type of progression with regard to concealed carry on campus. Yeah. Yeah. I just one other thing. You know, the thing is, you know, people make a big deal about it. You know, in Texas, you probably read newspaper articles about the concerns or demonstrations people have there. A year from now, it's going to be like a non-issue. You know, it's like going to be, people are going to wonder what all the fuss was about before it got. Yeah.
So I'm from Maine, and I took a class to get my concealed permit before they went to constitutional carry.
Right.
And one of the older gentlemen in the class couldn't hit the square target, so they didn't let him send in for his concealed carry. So now they've gone to constitutional carry. So don't you think that maybe there should be some barriers? So to me, I'm thinking, oh, now this guy, you know, can carry, and he can even hit, you know, this giant square.
Sure. Look, I have no problem with having permits myself. I think the big benefit from having permits is just to address the types of concerns that you have writ large, in the sense that when I have permits, I can tell you the rate of problems with permit holders. Okay, I can tell you how many people lose permits and for what reason that they lose permits. At least in a lot of states, you can get that type of data. And it allows me to go and say, look at the revocation rate for permit holders, look how low it is. I can't really do that when you don't have permits that are there. What I can tell you, though, is that there are a number of states that have permits and don't have training requirements. Okay, Pennsylvania, for example, is the largest state in population. We have about 1.1 million concealed carry permit holders in Pennsylvania. There's no training requirement. It costs $19 to go and get a permit for 5 years. Basically, you have to just pass a criminal background check. That's it. But if you look across the states, I can't find any difference in revocation rates for states that require training versus the ones that don't. And my guess is most people realize what's at stake when they go and get a concealed carry permit. You're talking about law-abiding citizens who generally have a lot to lose if they go and make some mistake. You know, use a gun improperly, use it in place where they're not supposed to use it and cause some type of harm that's there. You know, they realize, in fact, anything what you find, I would say, is almost too much reticence in some cases for permit holders to go and use their guns to stop attacks that might be occurring. So, you know, again, this is the type of thing where people can go and say these types of problems might occur. My response is, let's look at the data. You know, at least there are states that have both no training and permits. And so it allows me to at least look to some degree, I think pretty closely, at the type of issue that you're raising. So I just mentioned one thing just generally about these debates about guns, and that is one thing you just see over and over again is people raise possibilities of things that might go wrong. I remember after 9/11, I had several of the airline pilots unions contact me because they wanted, pilots wanted to be able to carry guns with them on planes. And I learned a lot from that. But one of the things that you learn, I went with them to several senators' offices. One was Dianne Feinstein, and senator from California. And her concern was, she said, just imagine you have two pilots, they get into an argument with each other, and they pull out their guns and they kill each other. And then what are you going to do? You got these locked, secure doors. You have two dead pilots. Nobody's able to go in there in order to try to help the situation. The thing is, one of the things that I learned was that from 1924 until 1963, all commercial airline pilots in the United States were mandated to carry loaded handguns with them whenever they flew. And from that point in time until 1979, they were allowed to do so. According to the airline pilots unions, they'd regularly have about 15% of their members carry loaded handguns with them when they flew up until 1979 when Jimmy Carter ended the practice. It was one of these laws that got started when the U.S. Postal Service started hiring planes to carry mail. And the concern was you'd have some biplane crash in a cornfield someplace, and they wanted to make sure the pilot had a gun so he could go and throw the mail there. But I'm sure this would be the first government regulation you've heard of like this. You know, it got in effect for a certain reason, and then they just forgot about it, and it stayed there for about 4 decades. In any case, you know, with regard to the senator's concern, we don't have to guess about that type of thing. Literally, you have hundreds of millions of flights over all those decades that you can go and look at. And there was not one single example of a problem with a permit holder having a gun, or a pilot having a gun. There's one case in kind of the modern era where there was an accidental discharge of a firearm by a pilot on a plane. But again, it kind of shows you kind of the problems of having too much government regulation on how they can carry their guns now, because what happens is the pilots are mandated, who are able to carry on planes, they're mandated to have their guns loaded at all times. But they're also required to put a trigger lock on and off the gun. Anybody bought a trigger lock? Okay. You ever notice in big letters on the package there, what does it say? It says, do not put the trigger lock on a gun that is loaded, okay? They say do not do this because when you put the trigger lock on, you may accidentally jiggle the trigger. So what does the federal government mandate that pilots do? They have to have their gun loaded and put the trigger lock on and off the gun while it's loaded and they're in the cockpit of the plane. So the rules are, you get into the plane, you sit down there, and at that point, you take the trigger lock off the gun. And then when the plane lands, you're supposed to put the trigger lock back on before you put it in your case and can remove it. Anyway, there was a flight from Chicago to Charlotte, North Carolina, where a pilot was trying to put his trigger lock back on his gun, and the gun accidentally discharged. But one of the things also I learned by doing this is that I think people watch too many James Bond movies where you think that you shoot a hole in the side of the plane and everybody gets sucked out of the plane. It doesn't happen. There's a reason why Air Force planes don't go falling out of the sky when they get hit by one bullet. I don't know if you know this, but I know there's at least one pilot in the room here. But when you fly on your planes, you know, your jets, there are holes in the plane. There's one hole at the back of the plane that pulls the air through the fuselage. One more hole, you won't even notice. Maybe make a little whistling noise or something, but it's not going to be something that you're really going to notice in the plane. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not familiar with the rest of your research, but in relation to what you spoke about earlier about more guns crime, I'm curious if your research takes into account other international concerns. I'm Canadian, for example. We have very low gun ownership, very, very tight restrictions on guns, but yet our murder rate, violent crime rate is massively, massively lower than it is in the States. In 2012, we had 172 firearms-related homicides in the U.S. at 8,800, and I understand that the population.
Yeah, well, you had very low crime rates before you had any gun control laws in Canada. Canada used to, up until the mid-70s, for example, allow concealed carry. You also, and ironically, Pierre Trudeau got rid of concealed carry in Canada. As soon as he stopped being prime minister, he asked for a special exemption so that he could carry. But in any case, here's the deal. There's a lot of problems with looking merely across places, because there's so many things that differ. One of the examples that people often give is they say, look at the UK. The UK has strict gun control, has few guns, basically have guns that anymore other than a shotgun at only the club. And handguns are completely banned. And they say, so it must, and they have low murder rates. So it must be the fact that they have strict gun control that causes low murder rates. The thing is, before they had the gun control, they had even lower homicide rates. That they went up after the January '97 handgun ban that they had. Over the next 8 years, the homicide rate in the UK went up by 50%. And so the thing is, in fact, I'll phrase it this way. Every place in the world that's banned guns, not just Washington, D.C. and Chicago, but every place in the world that we have crime data both before and after the ban, has seen an increase in murder rates. You think just out of randomness, you find one place where it went down. Now, with regard to Washington, D.C. and Chicago, the response to gun control advocates usually make is that those weren't fair tests, because unless you ban guns every place in the country, then people can still get guns from Maryland and Virginia in the case of Washington, D.C., or they can get it from the rest of Illinois or Indiana in the case of Chicago. Problem is, that may explain why murder rates didn't fall as much as they were predicting, but it doesn't explain why it shot up as soon as the guns were banned there. And you can look around the world where whole countries have banned guns. They've even been island nations that have banned guns. And you'll see 5, 6, 7, 8-fold increases in murder rates. I have a chapter in the War on Guns that goes through and looks at international data. After the ban goes into effect. And the question is, why does it go up every time? And I think the answer is pretty simple, and that is when you go and you ban guns, and this is generally applicable to all gun regulations, you have to ask yourself who's most likely to obey the rules. If you go and you ban guns, it's basically going to be the most law-abiding good citizens who are going to turn them in, relative to the criminals. And you actually make it relatively easier for the criminals to go and commit crimes. So, Canada would just say, there's some research that indicates that Canada's homicide rates, why it's so low, have gone up after the different gun control laws that you've had there in the country. And so, anyway, I could go on and talk about that for a long time.
I think we have to wrap up. If people have questions, I think you have time to talk to people individually, but a bunch of us have to get to class. So thanks everyone for coming.